Welcome to Impact, the show that covers various topics of interest in the arts, government, education, community, and entertainment arenas in and around the Capital Region. Next is our Science and Education segment with Barbara Brabetz. Barbara will be interviewing Dr. Nancy G. Slack, a professor and author. Dr. Slack will be talking about her scientific historic studies and also her books on the Alpines. So let's watch.
Welcome to the Science and Education segment on Impact. I'm Barbara Brabetz. My guest today, boy, we don't have enough time to go over everything that she does, is Dr. Nancy Slack. Nancy is a professor at the Sage Colleges, author, historian, ecologist, and co-panelist on WAMC Science Forum, where she and I are guests on Northeast Public Radio about once a month. Nancy, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. As the viewers can see, we have quite a selection of materials here, all of which are born out of you. So let's talk a little bit about your science background. You have been interested in science from early on.
Yeah, I've been a birder since I was 10.
Since 10?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
I was just excited by birds.
Oh.
I didn't know any real teenage birders not till I got to Cornell.
So you went to Cornell as an undergraduate, and you worked with some renowned people within the field of ecology. And then you went on for a master's degree also at Cornell.
Yeah.
And that one was in?
Botany and genetics.
Oh, botany and genetics, which is quite the combo these days.
Mm-hmm.
And then you went on, came back to the Capital Region, started raising a family, and then got your PhD at UAlbany.
Yeah.
That's quite a career.
I got 3 children into school with help from my husband.
Well, and then, of course, you stayed at the Sage Colleges, where you were a professor, have been a professor for many, many years, and started writing. So do we start with this small book right here?
Well, I'd written quite a few articles in various subjects, but I used to do ecological, I sometimes do workshops for the ADK at Adirondack Lodge. And one day, a young woman came. I was doing one of these workshops in which we were climbing Algonquin. A young woman came laden down with photographic equipment, taking pictures of everything. And when we got to the top of the mountain, there was a summit steward there. Those are the people that watch over see that dogs don't run around and help people learn about the flora. He was looking in his book, a very, very old book from the Appalachian Mountain Club, trying to find a flower that somebody wanted to know the name of. The two of us simultaneously, but separately, decided we needed a book for the Adirondacks.
And so a cooperative was born.
Yes, she's a photographer, designer, and she made a mock-up of this little book, and the Adirondack Mountain Club decided to publish it. And it's kind of nice because you can pull out the pages and see all the flowers from one particular, and the birds, and you can try that.
So you've got kind of durable paper here. You can be staring at the plant and be trying to identify the flowers that would exist in the alpine summits. So why is the alpine ecosystem so much different than what I would find in my backyard?
Oh, because the environment is different. The seed growing season is different. The soil is very different. It's mostly peat, not good soil of the kind we have in our gardens in the alpine. There are terrible winds. There are, could go through much of the year. Whiteface, where they're now working in New Hampshire, is higher and even more so. People die there every year. The Adirondacks are a little bit more user-friendly, but they still have really extreme weather, and these plants, mostly perennial plants that come up and stay there each year, are specially adapted to these areas.
So does it turn out that they're somewhat endangered or of concern from an ecological standpoint because they're in these little islands that exist only on the tops of mountains?
Yes, and that's what my current research is about. I don't know, we get to that now or later?
Sure, we'll do it right now.
All right. Well, I wrote another book a year ago. I published, actually, I edited this one, though I wrote a couple of chapters, which is actually all about a whole different group of ecosystems all over the world and how they're reacting to climate change. And we took bryophytes as our canaries in the coal mine. They're mosses and other small plants related to them, like liverworts.
So they're really primitive plants from an evolutionary standpoint.
Right, but they're extremely important plants from a diversity point of view. There are more of this group, more mosses, for instance, than any other kind of plants except flowering plants, more than
Amazing.
ferns or pine trees or any of those other things.
And I'm sure a typical child could name 20, 30 different flowering plants, daffodil, tulip, dogwood, but everything's a moss. A moss is a moss is a moss.
Yes.
But it's not, is it?
It's not. They're all different, and they all have, they're very particular about their environments, and they're also very close to the external environment. They've been used for air pollution studies for many, many years. The climate change is new, but there were hundreds of papers that people had already written on this subject.
On mosses and climate change.
Yeah, mosses and relatives and climate change. And in the Arctic and the Antarctic and the desert, all different ecosystems, and well funded, at least in Europe, compared to here for a while.
And what have the mosses told us about climate change?
Well, the part that I'm particularly interested in are the, as you said, alpine communities where there are snow beds. They're plants that live in snow beds. The snow lies a long time in these areas. They're sheltered. They're usually out of the wind, and sometimes into July. They're covered by snow. So a lot of plants, quite a few plants, both mosses and regular and flowering plants, are especially adapted for these places where the snow lies for such a long time. And in Europe, there are 3 chapters in the book that refer to that in Scotland, in Austria, and in Scandinavia and Sweden. The temperature has risen 2 or 3 degrees centigrade, and the plants in the snow beds are the most vulnerable to this raising of temperature.
Because they're protected for most of the year by snow, and now that snow is going away, and it's exposing them to an environment they're not used to.
And some of them are becoming extinct in these environments, and at least in our area, there's nowhere for them to go. I mean, if they can't go upward and they can't go downward, so they're gone if this happens. But they've been studied extensively in Europe, but they haven't been studied in this country on Mount Washington, where we're going to do this study, since the 1960s. So we need a baseline study. And I wrote a grant proposal, and it was accepted, and 4 of us are going to start that work on June 9th.
Well, we'll have to have you back once you have some results, and you can tell us the startling news that I'm sure you'll hear. So you've done New England and Adirondack Alpine Summit field books, I would call them, where, again, like that original book, someone can flip through it and find the plants that they're going to encounter.
After we did the first one, the Appalachian Mountain Club, which has many more members, wanted a book too, and they did a bigger one, and then eventually ADK did a bigger one for the Adirondacks. There have been 2 editions of this one.
Oh, that's terrific.
But it's not just plants, it's animals and birds and everything else, geology.
Yeah. I just happened to turn to the moss page, but again, there's more than just one moss, and everybody needs to know that.
And lichens too, lots of alpine lichens.
I'm a big fan. I like the lichens. I also wanted to talk about someone else who has been a great advocate for the environment and a consummate educator. That's G. Evelyn Hutchinson. And you are the author of the very first biography of this very important man. Can you tell us a little bit about him and then how you came to write this book?
Well, he's been called in print and newspapers and by Stephen Jay Gould the most important ecologist of the 20th century, and a living ecologist according to Stephen Jay Gould, though he's not alive anymore. But he actually started 4 or 5 new fields of ecology, including ecosystem ecology, with he and his graduate students and postdocs. And he was most proud of the people that he trained, first several young men and then women as well. Many of whom are now today's leading ecologists. But he was also a polymath, a person who was interested in very many subjects. He was an expert, for instance, on the medieval animal paintings, and about that. He knew everything about how many birds there were in England in the 13th century. I mean, things like that. But he was also interested in people, had interesting friends. Margaret Mead was a close friend. They both had connections with the Natural History Museum originally. Rebecca West, the author and journalist, was one of his very closest friends. He had 3 wives, but one of them was the middle one was for 50 years. And,
I guess that counts.
All very different women. They're in the book too, and they're all very interesting. I was at Yale with him his last year at Yale. I had a sabbatical from SAGE, and I spent that fall of 1990 with Hutchinson. But he also was an incredible letter writer. People who do history of science now have no idea what sources there were from earlier on. And 19th century letters are wonderful. Darwin had wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters, but he did too, and they were all collected. He even copied them with carbon paper originally, and kept his own copies of the ones he sent out, except the very personal ones, which were handwritten. But quite a few people gave me those letters too. And I interviewed 50 different people, his students, his friends, his co-professors, and all of that. So I tried to make a biography that was as much about the person, but also about his important work.
So if you want to pick up a book about a really dynamic personality, a very unique person, this would be a terrific gift or a great summer read, wouldn't you say?
Well, my friends say so. My friends who are not ecologists have been reading it.
Yes, it's certainly a book for all. All right, we're going to go to the last series of books because we're running out of time already. And that is a series of books called Creative Couples in the Sciences that you've been a part of for many, many years. Right. How did you come about to start writing in this series?
Well, I was teaching history of science at SAGE together with a historian, and I also taught a Darwin course, but I'd never done any research in history of science or writing. But I was asked to write something about the exploration of the Adirondacks in the 19th century for my bulletin for New York State. They published my thesis. I don't know why they asked me that, and I had no idea how to do it. But I went to the New York Botanical Garden and looked at the labels on the specimens, and then I tried to track down the people who had done the collecting. One of whom was an intrepid woman who had climbed all over those mountains in her high button boots and her long skirt, and had actually taught other people. So there were women involved too, and I got kind of interested in women in science. And we did an earlier book in which I wrote a chapter, but then we decided to do a book about couples that's about the men as well as about the women. Many of them American, some of them English. In some cases, the men really dominated the couples, but in a couple of cases, especially in England, the husband realized the woman was more talented and helped her along. So quite a variety. This book was used as a textbook in various colleges.
But it's also very readable to find out the kind of the yin and yang of a science couple.
But a few years ago, 2 European young women, one from Norway, one from Belgium, decided to do a sort of reprise on this book and set up a conference. At a conference in Budapest, we came and gave talks. The editors of this book were all invited. And so they have just done another book together with an American, Don Opitz, which is coming out next month, and you can read the title.
The title is, instead of Creative Couples in the Sciences, it's preambled for better or for worse, Creative Couples in the Sciences. So it's essentially a takeoff on the original book, exploring some of the same couples and then expanding upon others?
It's different couples, many of them European this time, but someone has written an interesting introduction, and I wrote the epilogue, which is about contemporary couples and how things have changed for couples in the last 30 years or so. And I went through that myself as a woman scientist. So.
Right, and of course I'm a scientist too, and I'm married to an engineer, so I guess that's close enough.
I'm
the dark horse.
I'm married to a physicist, and we do interact. We don't actually collaborate, but we do interact a great deal.
Well, Nancy, it's wonderful to have you here. It's wonderful to see the product of all of your creativity. We'll have to have you back again once your whiteface research has gone through at least one season, and we can talk about the signals of climate change that exist here in the Northeast. Dr. Nancy Slack, it's been a pleasure to have you here.
It's been a pleasure for me too, Barbara.
You've been watching the Science and Education segment on Impact. Thanks for watching.
Proctors, bringing the best in arts, education, and entertainment.